You're listening to Desire and Power with your host, Mira Salem.
Hey everyone, welcome back to Desire and Power. If you're new here, hi, I'm Mira, and this is the space where we talk about relationships, psychology, desire, power dynamics, attachment, shadow work, basically all the stuff that quietly shapes how we love, how we protect ourselves, and how we relate to each other as humans. Now, this is not a self help podcast in the here's 5 steps to fix yourself kind of way. It's more of a thinking space. It's a place where we slow things down, we look at patterns very honestly, and we try to understand why we do what we do without shaming ourselves or other people. So, if you're listening while walking or driving or lying on your bed and staring at the ceiling, then you're exactly where you need to be. Today's episode is one that I've been sitting on for quite a while because it touches something that people have a lot of feelings about. And we're going to talk about manipulation, but, and this matters, not in the way that it usually gets talked about online, okay? And I just want to say right off the bat, I am not here to defend harmful behavior. I'm not here to excuse abuse, and I'm definitely not here to tell you to ignore your boundaries. What I am here to do is slow the conversation down enough that we can make an important distinction, and it's one that gets lost a lot. Okay, there is a real difference between intentional malicious manipulation and unconscious fear-based strategies that people use when connection doesn't feel safe. And if we don't separate those two things, then this entire conversation collapses into moral panic instead of understanding. So, let me ground this just a little bit more before we go further. When I use the word manipulation in this episode, I'm talking about the quieter, kind of more common version of it. The kind that most people don't even experience as manipulation when they're doing it. Things like managing yourself so that you don't feel or so you don't get rejected, holding back your needs until it feels safer to express them, trying to stay one step ahead of your partner emotionally, trying to control situations because uncertainty just feels unbearable, right? Most people don't think like, I want power over someone. I'm manipulating the other person. They're just thinking, I don't want to fuck this up. I don't want to lose this. I'm scared of this. I don't trust it. Okay. And that distinction matters a hell of a lot. So the reason I wanted to do this episode is because I keep seeing people like smart and thoughtful and well-intentioned people that are just stuck in the same relational loops. And I think it's because they don't have a clear understanding of their attachment. But these people don't want control. They don't want games. They don't want power struggles. However, vulnerability feels risky, so their strategy ends up taking over. And instead of asking, what made this feel necessary, we jump straight into labels. And, sometimes those labels are accurate, but a lot of the times they're just protective shortcuts. And sometimes they keep us from actually understanding what's going on in our own nervous systems. Now, what pulled me deeper into this topic was actually a large piece of psychological research that I came across. It was a meta-analysis that looked at thousands of people, 13,000 people to be exact, and it found a consistent link between insecure attachment styles and what psychology calls Machiavellian traits. Now, if that phrase already makes you tense and freaked out, I get it, that makes sense, so we're going to start unpacking it slowly. But I want to say what struck me wasn't the label, it was actually the framing that this research had. Because instead of treating these traits as moral failures, the researchers actually treated them as adaptive strategies. So they weren't labeled as good or bad, they were just adaptive. And that word kind of changes everything. So in this episode, we're going to do a few things together. First, I'm going to walk you through what the research actually says in normal human language, and then also what it doesn't say. Okay, then I'm going to talk about how this shows up in real relationships, including my own, not as a confessional, but just as pattern recognition and lived experience. And finally, we're going to talk about what it actually takes to move towards security, not perfection, not invulnerability, but just the ability to stay connected without disappearing or controlling your way through intimacy. Now, this is not a light topic, but it doesn't need to be overwhelming. Okay. So if at any point you feel yourself tightening up, just, notice that, sit with it. You don't need to agree with everything. You don't need to label yourself. I just want you to stay curious. Okay. That's the only thing I'm really asking of you here. And I'm going to try to simplify this to the best of my abilities in this episode. So, with that grounding in place, let's talk about the research itself and why understanding adaptation is often a lot more useful than just assigning blame. All right. So now that hopefully we're settled in a bit, let's talk about the research that kicked all of this off. And I promise I am not going to turn this into a lecture. I'm going to try to keep you engaged. I want to talk you through it the same way that I encountered it. Slowly, skeptically, and with a lot of pausing and asking myself, okay, but what does this actually mean in real life? So first, let me just paint you guys the big picture here. The paper I'm referencing is a meta-analysis, like I told you, which means basically that it didn't just look at one small study and draw some big conclusions. It actually pulled together data from 27 different studies with over 13,000 participants, and it looked for consistent patterns. And that really matters because it reduces the chance that we're just cherry picking data and that we have something of value that we can talk about here. Now, what the researchers were looking at was the relationship between attachment styles and Machiavellian personality traits. Now, pause, okay? This is where a lot of people mentally check out or tense up. So let's unpack those terms before we go any further. First of all, let's unpack attachment theory and attachment styles, because even though it's talked about so much in modern dating today, I don't think everybody actually understands. So most people, have heard of these in the most simplified way, right? Secure, anxious, avoidant, sometimes disorganized, whatever. However, what I want to say here is that attachment is actually not about labels. It's about what your nervous system learned about connection. So, very simply put, when you were young, you learned something from your caregivers and your early relationships. You learned, is closeness safe or is it risky? Is need something that can be met or is it going to be punished? Is dependence allowed or is dependence dangerous? Okay. So attachment styles aren't personality traits. They are relational strategies. They're what your body learned to do in order to stay connected or to survive not being connected. And that's important because it already reframes things away from what's wrong with you and more towards what did you have to learn to survive. Okay? Now, let's talk about the scarier word, the Machiavellian traits, because culturally that word sounds intense, right? We usually think, oh, Machiavellian sounds like manipulation and coldness and calculation and power-hungry behavior. And those traits can look like that from the outside, but when we're talking in psychological terms, Machiavellianism is not a diagnosis. It's not a shorthand for bad person. It just describes a tendency towards indirect strategies in relationships. So this looks like emotional detachment, strategic thinking instead of emotional transparency, preference for control over uncertainty, belief that vulnerability is risky, managing outcomes rather than trusting people. So notice something really important here. None of that requires somebody to be bad or malicious, okay? It just requires somebody to believe, most of the time unconsciously, to be honest, that directness is unsafe, okay? So now let's talk about what the meta-analysis actually found. And it found that people with insecure attachment styles, especially fearful, avoidant, and disorganized attachment, were more likely to score higher on Machiavellian traits. So in other words, when somebody both wants closeness and doesn't trust it at the same time, they're more likely to rely on strategy instead of vulnerability. And that honestly makes a lot of sense if you think about it for more than 5 seconds, right? Because growing up, if your nervous system learned, I want connection and connection hurts, then you're stuck. You can never fully lean in But at the same time, you can't fully detach either. So what do? You start to manage. And this is where I really want to slow down because this is the heart of the misunderstanding. Okay? These strategies often develop before conscious intent. They are not choices in the moral sense. They are solutions that your nervous system arrived at. Okay? If you went through experiences where being honest got you rejected, where being needy got you shamed, where being open got you abandoned, then of course you have to learn over time to be indirect. You learn how to read rooms, you learn how to stay one step ahead, you learn how to control variables. And that's not you being a villain or being bad. That's just your nervous system adapting and preparing for disaster because that's what you've experienced before. Now, the study also looked at anxious attachment, which shows up a bit differently. Anxiously attached people often don't manage through distance, they manage through intensity. So, what you see with anxious attachment in people that escalate emotional expression, they seek reassurance repeatedly. Things like, sending 15 texts when you don't respond to them right away. They struggle to tolerate ambiguity. They use guilt or urgency to try to maintain closeness. Again, not because they want power over you, but because uncertainty feels like threat. Like they're literally in survival mode. You know, it looks like a different strategy from avoidance, but it's the exact same nervous system logic. It's all based around the same fear, the fear of rejection and the fear of abandonment. Now, what I found really important about this research is what it doesn't say. It does not say insecurely attached people are manipulators. It does not say manipulation is inevitable. It does not say this behavior is harmless. What it says is actually a lot more nuanced. It says that some behaviors that we morally condemn later in life actually originated as protective strategies earlier on. And I want that to sink in because you don't dismantle a protective strategy by attacking it. You dismantle it by making it unnecessary. And this is why shame is such a dead end here. But unfortunately, that's what we use in our society. Because when people feel accused or pathologized, they do not soften. Okay, they just get more strategic, they get more defensive, they double down on their very behaviors that everybody is trying to get rid of. So when we talk about manipulation without understanding attachment, we end up reinforcing the problem that we're trying to solve. Another piece of the study that I think is worth naming is that these traits are not fixed, okay? They exist on a spectrum. Somebody can be highly intelligent, empathetic, and relationally skilled, and yet still rely on strategy when they don't feel safe. This is why this shows up so often in people who are otherwise very self-aware. You can understand relationships and still not trust them. You can know all the language and still be scared. So if you've listened so far and you're thinking, shit, like this sounds familiar, I want you to hear this directly, okay? Recognizing an adaptive strategy is not an indictment. It is a starting point. Because once you see what you're doing and you see what you had to learn when you were younger in order to survive, then you can start asking yourself different questions. You can stop asking yourself, what's wrong with me? And you can start asking yourself, what would actually make this feel safe enough to let go of? And that's where you can start to change things. All right. So now that we've talked about the research and the psychology behind it, let's kind of start bringing it into real life. Because none of this matters if this stays theoretical. This is about how these patterns actually show up in dating, in sex, in intimacy, in the tiny day-to-day moments where power quietly changes hands without anybody naming it. And the first thing I want to say on this topic is that most power dynamics in relationships are actually not intentional. They're not somebody sitting there thinking, how do I control this other person? they're much more likely someone thinking, how do I not lose this? How do I not get hurt again? How do I not get fucked over? And those two motivations produce very different internal experiences, even if the outcome sometimes looks similar from the outside. One of the biggest misunderstandings we have about power in relationships is that we think that it belongs to the person who cares less. That's bullshit, okay? That is not true. Power belongs to the person who feels less at risk. And risk is not just about how much you like somebody. It's about how safe your nervous system feels inside connection. So let's talk about how this actually plays out, because this is the stuff that intrigues me more than anything, and I find it to be like the most fundamental psychological understanding of human connection that we all need to be able to interact with each other better. Okay? For people who lean more avoidant or fearful avoidant, power to them usually comes through distance. So they're the type of people that might take longer to respond back to you, right? They like to keep things ambiguous, a lot of maybes. They usually avoid defining relationships. They tend to intellectualize their emotions instead of expressing them. They pull back when things get close, when people open, when there's a lot of intimacy. So from the outside, this can look like confidence or detachment. But from the inside, it often feels like, if I just stay slightly removed, then I can't be crushed and this won't hurt as bad. So distance to them is actually just a form of control, but not over the other person. It's actually over potential pain. Now, for people who lean into the more anxious style, power often comes to them through intensity. So these are people that are going to escalate emotional expression quickly, can go, from 1 to 100 in seconds. They seek reassurance all the time. They text a lot. They feel distressed when they hear the word maybe. They tend to like overgive and people please, and they over explain everything they do. They try to secure closeness through urgency. So from the outside, this can look very needy or overwhelming. But from the inside, it feels like if I don't give everything of me, then this person that I'm with, they're going to disappear. Okay? So intensity becomes a way of anchoring connection when it feels like it could just vanish at any moment. And here's the part that's really freaking important that I mentioned earlier. Both of these strategies are about regulating fear. They're just doing it in opposite directions. One strategy says, I'll stay safe by not needing too much, and the other strategy says, I'll stay safe by holding on tightly. It is the exact same goal, but it's using different tactics. And this is where the word manipulation gets tricky, because manipulation in this context is not about deceit. It's about indirectedness. It's about trying to get a need met without directly stating it, without saying it plainly. Because if you said it plainly, maybe one time in the past that led to pain. So instead of saying like, hey, you know what? I just need a little bit of extra reassurance from you. You might just say nothing, and then you might withdraw. Or instead of saying, hey, we haven't really felt that close lately. I'm actually afraid that you're losing interest. Someone might just, escalate emotionally or create a bunch of drama instead of calmly stating what's going on for them, right? Easy. Instead of saying, I don't feel safe yet, somebody might just say nothing. Just stay vague, non-committal, again, very ambiguous. None of these are evil moves. They're protective ones. And this does matter because protection does have a cost. Because when needs are not named directly, they don't actually get met. They get managed. And managed connection never quite feels like intimacy. It feels like tension, like anticipation, like guessing. And this is where desire actually gets tangled up with power in really confusing ways for people. And of course, since this podcast is all about desire and power, let's talk about desire here for a second. Desire does not thrive in total safety, but it also doesn't thrive in constant fear. And what a lot of people mistake for chemistry is actually just nervous system activation. Like the push and pull, the uncertainty, the waiting, the intensity. That's not chemistry, guys. That's your nervous system going into fight or flight a lot of the times. When somebody is very unpredictable, your desire is going to naturally spike. And it's not because they're amazing, but it's because your nervous system is trying to resolve ambiguity. Okay. That's why power struggles can end up feeling erotic. Not because domination is inherently sexy, but because certainty has been replaced with vigilance, and vigilance feels like arousal when you don't know the difference yet. This is also why people who are very intelligent, emotionally literate, or psychologically aware can still get stuck here, because understanding something doesn't automatically make it safe. You can know why you're doing something and still feel compelled to do it. That's not hypocrisy. That's how the nervous system works. Another thing I want to name here, again, is how much shame complicates this entire thing. Because people who rely on distance often feel ashamed for needing anything at all. And then people who rely on intensity often feel ashamed for wanting too much. So instead of saying what's actually happening, everybody just ends up performing, right? Oh, I'm chill. Oh, I'm fine. Oh, I don't care. Yeah, whatever, do that. Right? We hear that kind of stuff all the time, but inside, people are actually calculating, monitoring, and bracing. And that's not connection, that is survival mode. And unfortunately, we have so many people in the world today with anxious or avoidant attachment styles due to the fact that our society does not place an emphasis on mental health and us actually learning how to sit with discomfort, that many modern day relationships are failing because nobody is secure in the attachment. And this is where things get really, really, really painful. Because when two people with complementary strategies come together, one avoidant, one anxious, that can lock them into a loop that feels incredibly intense, right? One pulls away, the other one reaches. The reaching feels threatening, so the pulling increases. The distance feels unbearable, so the reaching escalates. From the outside, that looks like chaos. It looks like drama. But from the inside, it feels like two people desperately trying to feel safe. And the honest truth is that neither of them are wrong. They're not wrong. But neither of them is getting what they actually need. That's why I'm trying to be so careful about how we talk about power, because power isn't always domination. Sometimes it's just about who can tolerate uncertainty better. Sometimes it's who learned earlier that they could survive alone. Sometimes it's who learned that needing somebody was dangerous. The shift towards security does not come from deciding to be less manipulative. It comes from learning how to tolerate uncertainty and name needs without managing the outcome and letting people respond how they want to respond and then survive that. And I get for a lot of you guys, that's probably terrifying. Like, not even conceptually terrifying, but somatically in your body. Because you're no longer protecting yourself through strategy, you're protecting yourself through self-trust. And that is a very, very different skill. So with that, in the next section here, I'm going to take everything we've talked about and bring it into my own story. Okay, not as an example for you to follow or anything like that, but I just want to give you real illustrations of how these patterns can play out in your life and how they can both protect you, but then also quietly exhaust you. And how moving towards security doesn't mean becoming softer or smaller. It actually means becoming more honest, even when that honesty does come with some risk. Okay? So that's where we're going to go next. And I want to start off my personal story with upfront honesty. Okay? I did not come into adulthood with a totally insecure attachment style. That's actually very important to say because, again, this whole thing is on a spectrum. So for you to understand my spectrum, I want to let you know that for the first 10 years of my life, I was actually pretty secure. I had loving caregivers. I felt seen. I felt held. I felt safe in my body. I also lived in a different country. I lived in Romania. And then at 10 years old, me, my mom, and my dad picked up. We took our life and we came to Canada. And that brought a lot of instability into my life. So that's actually when my attachment issues that were more less than secure started. It's when I was dropped into a new culture, when I realized that bullying was a thing here, like really bad bullying, when I realized that social hierarchy suddenly mattered way more than character. And then things began to shift for me, right? I learned very early on after coming to this country that love wasn't really. It actually, I can't even say that it was about love. It was about belonging for me. It really was. So it's not that I learned that like love is unsafe. What I actually learned is that belonging is conditional. And that's actually a little bit of a different wound. So I do want to be clear about that. Because my first experiences of romantic love did reinforce that whole belonging is conditional. But that's actually what I learned first. Okay. So my experiences of romantic love, my first couple of experiences that shaped how I was going to wire my nervous system up for connection later on in life, they were pretty shit. I had a lot of experiences with being chosen and then being discarded, being wanted privately but then denied publicly, being desired but not actually committed to, being told over and over again in different ways like you're close to being the one, but not quite, not quite. And then what that did to me over time was just plant this belief in my body that said, there's something about me that makes people not stay. Intellectually, from a very early age, I knew that wasn't true, but emotionally, it ended up living in my nervous system for years. And here's where this connects directly to the study that we've been talking about. Okay, the research shows that when people grow up or grow into, like I did, environments where connection feels unpredictable, the nervous system adapts. It doesn't just collapse, it gets smart. And for me, that adaptation wasn't manipulation in the obvious sense. For me, that was actually intellect. So it was pattern recognition, analysis, prediction. Oh my God, I would psychoanalyze the shit out of people when I was younger so I could try to predict their behavior so that I would stay one step ahead and they couldn't hurt me. Like and not just in romantic relationships. I'm talking like in my social circles. I became somebody who could read people extremely well. I could feel shifts before they happened. I could anticipate disappointment before it landed. And on one level, I do want to be very clear about this. It did help me. It genuinely did help me at the time. I learned a lot of psychology. In order to be able to do this well, I actually poured myself into learning. I learned history. I learned how humans behave under stress, under fear, under desire. And that knowledge didn't just keep me safe, but it actually became my work. It became my voice. It became my way of making meaning. So I am grateful for it. So when the study talks about manipulation or Machiavellian traits as adaptive strategies, it does land for me. Because what I was really doing wasn't trying to control people, but I was trying to control uncertainty. And control, to me, felt safer than hope. And here's the part that actually took me so long to see and to realize, took me into like my early to mid 30s. and really it was really after 35 that it really finally landed. That strategy of intellectualizing everything, as useful as it was, it did come with a cost. Because when you are always reading the room, when you're always anticipating reactions, when you're always holding back until it feels safe enough, you don't actually get met by anybody. You get managed, you get tolerated, you get something adjacent to intimacy. And I reached a point where I had to admit something very uncomfortable to myself. This works, but I'm lonely. I'm doing everything right, but I'm still not chosen. I'm fucking exhausted, and nobody even really knows me. And that's when things started to crack. It wasn't a breakdown, it was just a slow coming of age realization. And what really complicated this, and this is where power comes in, is that I also learned early on that I was too much in very specific ways. I was too intellectual, too ambitious, too sovereign, not feminine enough. So a part of my anxious attachment wasn't just fear of abandonment, it was actually the belief that being fully myself cost me love. And that's a brutal thing to carry. Because when every relationship becomes a negotiation between like who I actually am and who I think I need to be in order to stay loved, ooh, that's tough. That is fucking tough. And here's where control sneaks in again. I didn't lash out. I didn't cling. I didn't guilt trip. I did something much quieter, much worse. I just shrank internally. I held back on my needs. I timed my honesty. I fixed instead of asked. I carried emotional weight that wasn't mine. I managed. And again, I don't shame that version of me. Okay, she did not have the tools yet. She was doing the most intelligent thing she knew how to do with the information that she had. And in fact, honestly, when I look back at myself, I'm freaking proud of her because she did not become destructive. She did not become cruel. She didn't burn everything down. She chose understanding. And ironically, it was that same intellect, the same deep dive into psychology that eventually showed me the limits of my own strategy. Because at one point, you realize something kind of funny and kind of devastating. You can understand everything and still be avoiding risk. So the turning point for me wasn't letting go of control. It was learning how to tell the difference between intuition and fear, between something is actually wrong here and my nervous system is replacing an old story. So that's when I started crossing some small thresholds. I started saying the thing, naming the need, letting myself be seen before it felt safe. Not all at once, not dramatically. I just did it honestly. And the hardest part wasn't necessarily rejection in the abstract. It was just the risk of being unseen. Because like being rejected hurts, but being rejected without your value being recognized hurts on a whole other level. Especially when you know, like deep down in your bones, that you bring something really good to the table. You know that you're loving and that you're thoughtful and that you actually make people's lives better. And not having that mirrored back, that really fucking hurts. So the real work wasn't becoming secure enough to never be hurt again. It was learning how to hold my own value even when it was not reflected back. That's when things frickin' shifted and changed forever. They didn't necessarily, I said that so dramatically. Realistically, there was nothing external that changed, but internally, I started witnessing myself. I started approving of myself. I started choosing myself without waiting for permission. And that did something wild. It made rejection very survivable. It was painful. Still painful, always going to be painful. It's rejection, right? But it wasn't annihilating because I wasn't outsourcing my worth anymore. I wasn't asking relationships to confirm my right to exist as I am. I promised myself something very simple and very hard. I promised myself I will show up as me, fully me, honestly me, without freaking shrinking. And whoever can receive that with respect and admiration, great, awesome. They can stay. And if they don't, it'll hurt, but I'm still going to be whole at the end of this process. So that's what security looks like for me now. It's not certainty, it's not guarantees, it's the ability to live with uncertainty without abandoning myself. So when I look back at that earlier version of me, like the anxious one, the strategic one, the always trying to stay ahead of loss one, I genuinely don't see failure. I see somebody who was protecting something precious. She just didn't know yet that she deserved safety without disappearing. And, if you've been listening to this and you recognize yourself anywhere in here, if control feels safer than honesty, if power feels easier than vulnerability, I genuinely don't think there's anything wrong with you. I think that you just learn how to survive. The question isn't whether that strategy makes sense. The question is whether it's still the life that you want to live. And that's the question you need to sit with. So I want to close this episode by grounding everything we've talked about in reality. because understanding why we do what we do is important, but understanding alone doesn't change behavior. At some point, insight has to turn into responsibility. And this is what it all comes down to: personal responsibility. I want to be really, really clear about this part. Just because a behavior is adaptive doesn't mean that we get to keep running on it forever. Just because something made sense once doesn't mean that it still gets to drive our relationships now. Like, at some point, we become responsible for updating our nervous system. Nobody else can do it for us. And this is the part that people want to skip because it's uncomfortable. It means looking at your own attachment style and saying, okay, this explains me, but it doesn't freaking excuse me. It means noticing when you pull away, noticing when you cling, when you manage, when you manipulate indirectly. And don't blame yourself for your past, but look at what you do in the present. At the end of the day, awareness is step one. Everyone knows that. But ownership is step two. Like, okay, I see it now. It's me. I'm doing this. I'm responsible for this. Where do I go from here? How do I change? Right? Without step two, nothing actually happens. So here's the thing though. And this is worth talking about. This work is hard, okay? It is, but it's not impossible. And it isn't as terrifying as people make it out to be. It's not. Becoming more secure is not about fixing yourself or becoming perfect or never getting triggered again. That's fairy tale thinking, okay? This is much simpler, but it is much more demanding because it's about learning how to love yourself enough to feel safe inside yourself. Sounds like a Hallmark card, I know, but it's hard, because this is not inflated self-love. I'm not talking about toxic positivity, and I'm not talking about pretending that you're healed because that's apparently trending. I'm talking about real self-love, the kind that says, I am safe with myself, I am significant, I matter, I am enough because I was born enough, I am worthy of love, even when I'm uncomfortable, even when I'm raw, even when I'm real. Okay? This is not an affirmation poster. This is called parenting yourself. Most insecure attachment patterns exist because at some point we did not get consistent emotional safety when we needed it. So the work now is to become the secure caregiver for yourself. And that's going to look like this. It's going to look like soothing your nervous system instead of outsourcing regulation. It's going to look like validating your emotions without letting them control your behavior. It looks like setting boundaries without disappearing. It looks like asking for needs without collapsing if the answer is no. This is actually inner child work, but it's not, inner child work in a fluffy way. This is daily, repetitive, sometimes really boring work. This is catching yourself in real time, choosing a different response, and practicing safety over and over again until your body believes you. And here's something I really want to name because it's important. Secure attachment isn't just something that happens inside you. It also happens between people. Two secure partners together is freaking incredible, okay? That is the gold standard. But if we're going to be honest with where we are right now, it's rare. However, this is super important thing to end off this podcast with. Even one secure person in a relationship can change everything. A secure partner doesn't play the anxious games. They don't play the avoidant games. They don't escalate. They don't withdraw. They don't punish. They don't disappear. They are steady. They are clear. They are emotionally present. And that steadiness can actually become a regulating force for somebody who's insecure. And if this is important, that person is willing to grow. Security is contagious, but only when there's accountability. This does not mean staying forever with somebody who refuses to change. It does not mean tolerating manipulation or harm. It does not mean sacrificing yourself to be a healer. Okay? It means that secure people lead by example, not by force. So if you want more successful relationships, genuinely successful ones, one of the most powerful things you can do is become the secure partner. Not to save others, not to fix partners, but because security creates conditions where honesty, repair, and growth are possible. And even if the relationship doesn't last, you can still walk away intact. That's power. And zooming out even further, and this is where I think the work gets even bigger than dating, when more people learn how to regulate themselves, how to love themselves, how to show up without fear running the whole show, then human connection overall changes. We see less manipulation, less reactivity, less power struggle, more clarity, more steadiness, more trust. This is not just personal work. This is cultural work. So if there's one thing I want to leave you with, it's this. You do not become secure by waiting for the right person. You become secure by deciding that you are responsible for your emotional world. That responsibility is not punishment, it is freedom. Because when you can make yourself feel safe and loved and enough, you can stop asking for relationships to do impossible jobs. And from that place, intimacy becomes something you choose, not something you manage, not something you chase, and not something you fear. This work takes time, it takes patience, it takes honesty, but it is absolutely possible and it is so freaking worth it. Because learning how to love yourself, and I mean really love yourself, is the foundation of every healthy relationship you are ever going to have. Okay? I'm going to leave it there. I want to thank you all for being here. Thank you for listening and for being willing to think deeply about this with me. For more deep dives into erotic psychology, relationship advice, and shadow work, consider subscribing to my Substack and follow me on all my other socials linked in the show notes. See you guys next time, where I interview a person with a disorganized attachment style and we talk about what she did to fix it.
Thanks for listening. Be sure to hit that follow button to know when the next episode releases.